We're going to get started as soon as we can. This is the legislative update, and everyone here is very lucky to hear from Jenna Hall, the Associate Director of Strategic Policy, Legislative and Parliamentary Affairs at Health Canada's Canada's Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Branch. We have Ethan Bain from Engagement Alberta Cannabis Secretariat, and Matt Zablosky, Business Strategist Cannabis for the City of Calgary. And so we're going to get an update first from Jenna, who's going to give an overview of what's going on with federal law and legislation at the moment. And then we're going to hear more at the provincial and municipal level. So if anyone here has any questions after they're done talking, this will be a great time to engage with these folks. And I believe we will have a little bit of time afterwards as well if the Q&A goes on. So I'm just going to let Jenna jump right in if she's ready. And after everyone's done talking, we'll open up the floor to Q&A.
Thanks. Thanks very much. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a primer in terms of, whoa, that's a loud primer. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a primer in terms of the federal commitment, thank you, in terms of the federal government's commitment to legalize, what's going on with the legislation, what's going on with the regulations, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about timing for all this too, because that's a question we're getting really frequently these days. So basically in Canada, we have a policy problem. And the policy problem is that we've been living in a prohibition-based regime for 100 years, but at the same time, Canada has one of the highest cannabis consumption rates in the world, and that's especially true of youth. We know that Canadian youth aged 15 to 19, about 1 in 5 of them has used cannabis within the last year, and for the 20 to 24-year-old age group, it's closer to 1 in 3. We know as well that there is a large unregulated industry that is supplying those Canadians, and that the product that they're selling is not regulated, it's not quality controlled, and that often the profits are ending up in the hands of organized crime. So this is a significant policy problem, and it's one that really is unique in Canada. So what we're doing is we're trying to create a new public health-based control framework for cannabis in Canada. And so many of you will be aware that in spring of 2017, the Government of Canada introduced Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act. The Act is really based on a public health approach. It's designed to try to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth and profits out of the pockets of organized crime. And it essentially establishes a few things. So one is a series of permissions and consequences for operating outside those permissions. The second is a series of penalties that are designed to be proportional to the seriousness of the offense. The Act will provide as well protections for youth, including a minimum age for purchasing cannabis, criminal penalties for any adults who supply cannabis to youth or who use them in committing a cannabis-related offense, and then clear federal oversight in many of the areas that the federal government regulates today in terms of the regime whereby you can get access to cannabis for medical purposes. So that is to say the federal government will be overseeing cultivation, production, manufacturing of products, product safety, and packaging and labeling. The other thing that the Act does, and you'll hear a little bit more about this from my provincial colleague, is it creates space for the provinces to do a couple of things. So one of those is to impose additional restrictions. So for example, a province could set the minimum legal age to buy cannabis higher, for example, if they wanted to align it with the age of access for alcohol. There's also space within the legislation for provinces to regulate retail access. And again, you'll hear more about that today from my provincial colleague. And pretty much without exception, every province and territory in Canada has decided to occupy that space. So if you think of the legislation as kind of being the foundation of the house, the bricks and mortar of the house is the regulation. So that's really the system of much more detailed rules that will come into place when the Cannabis Act comes into force. And in developing those regulations, we've been doing it under a fairly compressed time frame and in a way that we feel has been really consultative. So the first thing we did is we published a regulatory proposal. It was available widely on the internet, and we set it out to targeted stakeholders, provinces, territories, Indigenous communities, anyone who we felt would have a really good perspective that they needed to share on what that structure of rules should look like. The regulatory proposal covered things like how we might go about licensing cultivation and production. And so some of you might have heard that we've proposed to introduce a new class of cultivator and manufacturer called a microproducer. And the idea behind that is to allow really small businesses to be able to make their way into the cannabis industry if they want to do so. The regs as well would talk about things like security clearances. What should security clearances look like in order to keep organized crime out of the business? And when we're issuing those security clearances, should we be making space in the industry for folks who have past cannabis-related crimes that were not violent in nature? So that's a particular question where we were wanting public input. They talk as well about a proposed approach to health and safety standards for the product itself and packaging and labeling, which is of course a critical aspect of ensuring that youth aren't enticed by cannabis products once they're available for retail sale. And the regulatory proposal speaks as well, and this is something that's near and dear to my own heart, to how Canadians would continue to access cannabis for medical purposes under the new regime. So the next steps in terms of that process, we'll have taken all of the input that we received. We're going to publish 2 reports. The first one is going to tell you what it is we heard through the consultation process, and the second one is going to tell you how we've changed the regulatory proposal, that system of rules that I've been talking about, as a result of that input. So just a couple of really quick things before I wrap. One is I just want to say how foundational public education is to the public health-based approach that we're taking as we legalize and strictly regulate cannabis. We have been working very closely with colleagues in provinces and territories and non-government organizations to roll out successive waves of public education and awareness, and that's going to continue to happen up to the coming into force of the legislation and well beyond that. The other thing I wanted to talk about quickly is research. I think any of you who have been involved in this space as medical clients, as licensed producers, would agree that we need to know a lot more about the health effects, the social effects, et cetera, of cannabis. The government, if you've consulted Budget 2018, there were some really nice investments in there, both on the public education side and on the research side that hopefully will be really helpful for us going forward. I'm just going to wrap with a little bit of information on timelines. We're getting that question a lot these days, that hopefully will not add to the already the complexity that you probably also see when you look towards Ottawa. So right now the legislation is undergoing review by the Senate, and it's been referred to 5 different Senate committees, which is very highly unusual. And those Senate committees will kind of be looking at the subject matter of the legislation from a bunch of different angles. As part of that process, the Senate is probably going to recommend amendments to the legislation, so they may change it in some ways as a result of their review process. They vote on it, and then it goes back to the House of Commons. So the Senate has committed to vote on the legislation by June 7th. So now you're going to hear me use the word assuming a lot. Assuming that they do vote by June 7th, the bill goes back to the House of Commons. The House will stop sitting for the summer at the end of June. So it's our hope that in that intervening period of time between the time when the Senate votes and the bill goes into the House, we'll receive parliamentary concurrence with the bill, and the bill will receive royal assent. So assuming the bill receives royal assent at the end of June, what the government has said is that we will provide a transitional period of 8 to 12 weeks between royal assent of the bill and the coming into effect of the Cannabis Act. So what that'll be is an 8 to 12 week period where some really important things need to happen. Provinces and territories will need to finalize their regulations. Product will need to be packaged, shipped, placed on retail shelves. Law enforcement will need to be trained around the final implications of the new legislation, and we'll be rolling out, as I mentioned, public education for Canadians in terms of what the bill contains, what's legal and what's not legal under the bill, and also what that transition period means. So hopefully that demystifies the timing a little bit. When the Minister of Health spoke to this issue outside the House of Commons, she said, do the math. So I've just kind of given you enough information to be able to do the math in terms of when we're looking for legalization to come into effect. So thank you very much. Really a pleasure to speak with you today, and I'll yield some space to my colleagues.
Thank you. I'll try and be relatively brief so we can allow ample time for questions, but before we do that, I'll just give you a brief overview of the approach the provincial government has taken to managing our role in this. And as Jenna was mentioning, the federal legislation sets out a basic framework in which each province and territory had some important decisions to make. And the first thing we did with respect to that is went out and engaged with Albertans through an online survey that actually came in 2 rounds that many of you may have seen and or completed. And in fact, we had almost 70,000 completed surveys from Albertans, which is the largest single response the government of Alberta has ever had to any online survey it's done. So this is not surprisingly a subject of great interest to people. We also met directly with almost 200 organizations ranging from stakeholders in public health, to education, to law enforcement, to licensed producers and others who are interested in getting into this industry. And what we heard from them informed us in designing our legislative framework. It validated for us that the 4 policy priorities that the Alberta government has laid out were right and were strongly supported by Albertans. And those are keeping cannabis out of the hands of children and youth, protecting public health, promoting safety on roads and workplaces, and limiting the illegal market. And so all of our legislation and regulation has been designed with those objectives in mind. And as you can imagine, it has in some cases represented a trade-off between different ones of those objectives. In the fall, we took what we heard, we combined it into the Alberta Cannabis Framework, which hopefully most of you have had a chance to review on our website, alberta.ca/cannabis. And that outlines all the major pillars of what the legalized system will look like in Alberta. As was mentioned, provinces had the discretion to look at the minimum age for consumption and consider lining that up with our legal drinking age, which in Alberta meant we left the minimum age at 18. We also had some decisions to make about places in public where cannabis could be consumed. And from a provincial point of view, our primary concern was with the public health impacts of consumption, in particular of smoking and vaping. So we looked at limiting or prohibiting smoking and vaping in places where smoking tobacco is currently prohibited, and some additional areas that are typically frequented by young people. And so in Alberta, there will be some areas where public consumption is permitted. There will not be licensed venues such as cafes or lounges, at least initially. We have some concerns with moving backward on the progress that's been made on tobacco over the last number of decades in terms of allowing indoor consumption of a smoked product. So at some point in the near future, a wider range of cannabis products will be legal for consumption, including edible products. We may at that point revisit the decision around cafes and lounges, but they won't be part of the system in Alberta on day one. What will be part of the system in Alberta on day one is storefront retail operated by private operators, licensed through a rigorous process through the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission. And they, of course, have the expertise with licensing and overseeing the private liquor retail market in Alberta over the past 20 years. And they will incorporate a number of features of that licensing and compliance process in the cannabis process, although the due diligence, at least initially, will be certainly more strict than is in place for retail liquor applicants. In addition to storefront sales by private retailers, cannabis will be available online in Alberta through an e-commerce site operated by the AGLC. And I do just want to be clear on this because there's some misconceptions out there. So private retailers will not be allowed to sell cannabis online. The only legal non-medical sales in Alberta will be through the e-commerce platform of the AGLC, which will operate in parallel to the existing medical cannabis system regulated by the federal government, in which, of course, consumers can obtain their cannabis directly from licensed producers. With respect to the retail system, because I imagine that's where a lot of the interest in the room here today is, the AGLC will be opening the license application process on March the 6th. So All of the information pertaining to that is available on the AGLC website right now, and if there's interest, I suggest you start looking at that and start looking at all of the requirements around that process, because they are quite considerable in terms of being able to demonstrate lack of a criminal background and all of the financial requirements, security plan, and the other technical requirements that go into that application process. With that, the province has set some basic regulatory parameters that cannabis retailers will have to follow. So we've established a maximum range of hours of operation that are the same as we have for liquor retail stores in Alberta today, 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. And individual cities and other municipalities will have the discretion to further restrict those if they see fit. We've also established some minimum setback distances for cannabis retail stores, 100 meters from schools and 100 meters from provincial healthcare facilities. And again, each individual community may establish additional setback distances as is appropriate for the local circumstances. And one final point I just wanted to make on the retail licensing process, because there are a lot of rumors and uncertainty out there. The AGLC has made a prediction that there may be 250 retail licenses issued in the first year. That does not reflect a cap on the part of the provinces. So the license application process is not a first come, first serve. March 6th is the opening date. It's not the mandatory date when applications have to be in. There's no limit. Assuming people are qualified, ready, pass through the requisite municipal approval processes, everyone will have an opportunity to participate in this industry. So we don't expect lineups around the corner on March 6th. It's not necessary to do that. It is necessary to fully inform yourselves as to the requirements and make sure you've completed those applications in all their details. I'm not going to say any more right now. I will be happy to discuss the rationale for any of the provincial policy decisions that you see reflected in our legislation and regulation, whether it be minimum age, whether it be public consumption, or some of the decisions around the retail model. But I'll maybe leave that to your questions, and with that, I'll turn it over to Matt. Thank you.
So hi, everybody. My name is Matt Zablosky, and as mentioned, I'm from the City of Calgary. I'm the project lead for the legalization of cannabis for the city. And kind of what we're doing is exactly what I'm doing here, is following on the heels of the province and the feds, or the federal government, I should say. So basically, what we've done is much exactly what the federal government and what the provincial government has done back in November through January, November 2017 through January of this year. We conducted stakeholder engagement. We conducted online survey. I will say ours was actually only the second most popular survey. Apparently in Calgary, roadside signs are a far more interesting topic than cannabis. But that being said, so we conducted our engagement over the winter. And when the AGLC came out with their regulations on February 16th, we came out with a committee date on the February 21st, where we as administration provided to that committee recommendations on what the regulations for Calgary, specifically around the land use bylaw piece, so the zoning piece as most people think of it, should be. So February 21st, we brought that forward. They made a recommendation on our report, and that report is going to go to City Council on April 5th. So I know that everybody's come here looking for a lot of certainty as to potential retailers wanting to apply and that type of thing. Certainly the AGLC process can get started on March 6th. As far as the City of Calgary process, though, we will have to wait till at least April 5th to get an idea from Council as to what the final regulations in the city will be. And then I anticipate that much like the province where they announced the regulations on February 16th, but they won't start taking applications till the 6th, very, very likely the city will have a similar process where we will finalize our regulations hopefully on April 5th, and then have the actual application process start a few weeks down the road from there. But basically give us enough time to respond to whatever council decides on, as well as educate potential retailers and the city, citizens of the city at large as to what we're proposing. So As far as what we put forward for the municipal regulations as it pertains to the land use bylaw piece, things like 150-meter separation distance from schools and from emergency shelters. There is a 300-meter separation distance that we recommended between stores themselves. Initially, we as administration had recommended a 30-meter separation distance between liquor stores to cannabis stores. And I want to emphasize that the committee basically told us to come back and say not the 30-meter separation distance, but rather just not adjacent to one another is all that they've asked for. So there has been some request for clarity around that. So the other thing that I would say is in the downtown core, so what we call the CR20 zoning, that separation distance does not exist in that zoning, as well as the CR2 and the CR3. These are regional large shopping centers. The separation distance in those areas from liquor stores doesn't exist, nor does the separation distance between cannabis stores themselves. So the other piece that's going to be important from the city standpoint is the business licensing piece. So the zoning, the recommendations were made at committee on the 21st. We bring the business licensing piece to committee on April 3rd, and that will have, we were anticipating to have many regulations that actually the AGLC has already taken on themselves. So basically it's going to be city business license, much similar to how liquor stores, for example, currently operate. They require AGLC licensing. They also require municipal city business licensing. So that's going on April 3rd, but both the recommendations from the 21st committee, the February 21st committee, and the April 3rd committee will both go to City Council on April 5th. So that's, like I say, when we're hoping to have a final decision from Council on what the regulations for the city will be. The other thing I suppose I'd like to emphasize as well is, though, much like the province, although we'll likely be able to start taking applications in within a few weeks of April 5th. As far as when these are when business licenses are going to be issued to people, when people are going to be able to get development permits, is really contingent upon the federal timeline as far as legalization goes. So you just heard about the June 7th decision from Senate and the 8 to 12 week delay after it goes back to the House of Commons. Really, we are, as a municipality, are waiting for that as well. So we need to find out on our own end when the legalization is actually going to come into effect for the country in order to be able to start issuing these business licenses and development permits. And really, there's a lot of more detail I can get into, but I want to leave it open to questions here. So as Ethan mentioned, happy to stick around afterwards to answer questions from people as well. We found that yesterday that was really beneficial. So I'll sit down and open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we have a representative from the federal government, the provincial government, and the city government here. So if anyone has any questions, now is a wonderful time. Going to be a lot of questions. Put your hands up, and I'll just start getting to you one by one.
Hello. So I am from the Students Association at Mount Royal University, and we are having a lot of interesting discussions, especially around bylaws and land use and things like that. My question is, once the, I guess, exploration of having cafes, lounges, et cetera, things like that, because I understand the zoning around retail specifically for cannabis products. But once the conversation opens up around cafes, how do you foresee that sort of interaction with current environments that serve liquor? So at the Students Association, we have a bar. We serve alcohol there. We don't sell alcohol in a retail space, for personal consumption, but we do sell beer in our bar. And so I'm wondering how you envision that process intersecting once that becomes more prevalent.
So, really good question, and I know a lot of post-secondaries in Alberta are looking at their own policies around what's going to be allowed in terms of, consumption in residences, for example, in terms of growing plants, and in terms of what types of retail locations might be allowed on a campus. With respect to cafes and lounges, I do want to emphasize that's a question of if, not when. So there is, as you refer to, a conversation that's going to need to take place when some regulations come in for edible products from the federal government. And it's interesting to have all three levels of government up on the stage here today, because usually we all blame each other and nobody from the other level of government is there. But when we have those regulations and we see what exactly is going to be allowed for sale, and whether it's only, for example, prepackaged products that might be available in a store versus what might be served in an eating or drinking establishment, that will inform what needs to go into that conversation. I would say as a general principle, and you'll see this throughout the Alberta policy framework, we do not encourage the co-use of alcohol and cannabis. There are very significant exacerbating effects on impairment, and there are other health consequences that we do not encourage. So this is one of the reasons we required a separation of business between a cannabis retailer and a liquor retailer. So it'll go into the conversation at that time. I'm sure there will be interest from those who have liquor licenses that allow them to serve patrons, but the conversation will be within, I think, the principles that we've already established in our policy framework, that the co-use of those things is not something we encourage. It's not something we have at the retail level in terms of co-location, so I would suggest that would be unlikely.
Thanks for being here, all three of you. My question's for Jenna. I first have a comment and two questions. First of all, thank you very much for being open and transparent and speaking to sort of what we know and what we don't know. In particular, sort of recognizing the harms that prohibition has done on cannabis, so appreciate that. The first question is around the licensed dealer category. So we know a lot of people are applying for licensed dealers to deal with cannabis in various ways, and I know that the Cannabis Act is proposing the research and development licenses to sort of maybe replace that. Will you continue to allow existing LDs that have been granted their exemptions and grandfathered them into the research and development licenses, or will those stop being accepted post-legalization? If you can share some thoughts on that, if you can.
Is my mic live? Yes, it is. I have to be honest, I have no idea how to answer that question. What I can do, though, is I can find somebody back at the office who's a little closer to what they're proposing around the research licenses.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
and then no worries. And then the other question was in regards to security clearances. So we're seeing that directors, offices and directors need to be cleared before they can be on files. So can they be nominated to a board before they're actually cleared for security clearance, or do you have to wait for that to happen before they can be added to a board?
Yeah, so they should be seeking a security clearance before they're formally nominated to the board.
Thank you so much.
Yep, no problem.
Hi there, my name's Alan, and my question is dealing with the cost associated with the municipal license application. With the provincial government has outlaid their costs associated, I just wonder if you can enlighten us to the city.
Yeah, so we'll be bringing the recommendations to the Committee on Business Licensing for the city on April 3rd, but what I can say is that so far we've not anticipated increasing costs for municipal licensing beyond what's existing for other licenses. So we imagine that it's going to be very much in line for liquor stores, et cetera, in the city.
Hi there. I was just wondering, are we going to get any kind of guidelines as to what kind of marketing avenues are available for a retailer, either from any of your levels of government? And secondly, are we allowed to have a website where we don't sell, but we can kind of, differentiate ourselves? Thank you.
Let me take that one. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. So both in the legislation and in the regulatory proposal that Health Canada published, there are constraints around promotion and advertising. Some of those are things like, you can't use sports figures to promote. You can't make health claims related to some of the products. So what you'll see is when the next regulatory paper comes out, you're going to see a system of rules around what that looks like. Provinces would have the ability, and as would municipalities if they chose to, they would have the ability to build on to some of those rules. So I don't think we've given you anything that would tell you specifically how that pertains to retail, but any broader prohibitions would apply to the retail space as well.
And I'll just very briefly add to that. One of the things that's informed our design for some of the rules around retail is the proposed restrictions on promotion and advertising in the federal bill. So, as you will have noted, retail stores will only be accessible. Will not have minors allowed in them, even accompanied by a parent. And one of the reasons is that essentially the only area where a lot of advertising and promotion activity is allowed is in spaces that are where minors are restricted from entering. So we did want to allow some product display to occur within the retail environment. In an online environment, we would anticipate similar restrictions. So if you had, for example, a website where people could sign in and you could verify their age, or you have a mailing list that goes only to age-verified consumers, there might be some promotional communication you could do through that avenue within the confines of the federal restrictions. But other than that, no. This is much more of a, in that sense, a tobacco model than anything else.
Hello. So retailers have to buy from the AGLC, and the AGLC will do all the online sales. How will the AGLC handle the situation where online sales is doing so much better than retail and starts to choke out the retail market, and those people who have those licenses are now out those sales?
Really good question, and certainly the decision for government to operate the online e-commerce platform was taken very thoughtfully, and it was informed by what we heard from Albertans, which personally surprised me a little bit, thinking that we're in the 21st century where everybody kind of unproblematically just buys everything they want online. We did hear a significant and legitimate degree of concern from people about how the age verification would work, both at the point of online ordering and in particular at the point of delivery to consumers. And that was one of the real important factors in determining that the e-commerce would be operated by the AGLC. That being said, we did at the same time take a policy decision to allow private retailers. So the intent is not to prejudice the e-commerce system at the expense of those online retailers. However, the AGLC is going to have to be continually vigilant to make sure that they're pricing products appropriately so that they're not undercutting private retailers, and certainly they're not going to be, again, contrary to some of the rumors out there, they're not going to be selling at wholesale. The intent is to have a retail price that's in line with the retail prices that are offered by the bricks and mortar retailers. But quite frankly, we think there's room for both channels out there. There's a lot of areas in Alberta, particularly rural and remote communities, where they're not going to be able to sustain a retail location. They just don't have the population. And we feel it's important for those communities that they do have access to safe, legal product. And so I think in a lot of respects, the online channel is going to be complementary to private retail.
Thank you.
I have two questions for you today. The first is directed to the federal representative, please. Given that our waterways, lakes, oceans are federal domain, has the federal government, to your knowledge, come up with a policy for consumption in relation to, shall we say, boating, kayaking, things of this nature?
So that's an excellent question, and I'm sorry I don't know the answer, but I can try to find somebody for you who does. Are you thinking particularly of federal parks?
Well,
like national parks?
let's just say an Albertan went out to British Columbia and got on Lake Okanagan on a boat. The question then would be, is it legal to consume a controlled substance, which is an intoxicant, on a boat? You can't drink a can of beer, so can you light up?
So I'm sure that that's something that my colleagues at Public Safety have thought through, but no, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
Okay, second question then is for the representative from Alberta. So just for clarity, tagging on to the federal answer, as I understand what you've said, the wisdom of the current government here in the province of Alberta is that if I'm sitting on a park bench down by the river in the summer, I can functionally light up and I'll be okay. But if I snap open a can of beer, I can be arrested and fined.
Essentially, that's correct, and I will say with a couple caveats. One big caveat is that, as I mentioned, we regulated the smoking and vaping from the point of view of our primary concern being secondhand exposure to smoke. There is an opportunity for local governments to further regulate it from the perspective of public nuisance, public morals, or what they feel is in the interest of their community, and I know a number of them have expressed interest in putting additional restrictions on, whether it's in some cases to say you can't do it in parks, or in other cases to say maybe you can only do it in this park. But certainly from our perspective, it was a balance between needing to have some places where you can legally consume a legal product, and not everybody has a private residence that they own where they can consume it. And we know that landlords and condo boards are looking at, do they need to take measures to address the smoking? So
I don't mean to interrupt your answer, but you're getting away from the question that I asked. The question I asked is, we have two controlled substances, both of which are intoxicants, and the government, from what you're telling me, feels that it's okay to have one, but it is prepared to continue to penalize for having the other. Do you not see a certain irony there?
Yes, I believe the first thing I said in response to your question was yes, there is that difference, and then I was proceeding to try and explain our rationale for the difference. In the one case, being smoking and vaping of tobacco, the focus on secondhand exposure to smoke. And there are other properties of alcohol as an intoxicant that make it not exactly analogous to cannabis as an intoxicant. Although I would say in both cases, of course, there are provincial laws against public intoxication, and that would apply to intoxication regardless of the substance.
Okay, I've got a question back here. Was there someone over here that had you, and then I'll get you, and then I'll come back up to the front here. Is there anyone over on this side who has questions as well? Okay, I'll get to you after I get these folks here.
You've addressed proximity rules to liquor stores, and you've addressed the discouraging of co-consumption of liquor and cannabis. Have you addressed at all proximity to retailers to licensed establishment, bars, restaurants, etc.?
So from the city's perspective, no. Basically, what we saw approved at committee last on the 21st, I should say, was very similar to what we have for liquor stores currently. There's no separation distance required of liquor stores to a drinking establishment, for example, and same would go for what's been proposed for cannabis stores to these drinking establishments. That being said, again, the final decision date that we're hoping for is April 5th. So there is still the potential for things to change, but based on what we've recommended so far, there's no separation distance requirement there.
So just to clarify, a retailer and a bar could share a common wall?
Yes, in theory, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I just want to make sure everyone knows we have a good 10 more minutes of questions, so I'm going to hit you. We've got a couple people up here. I've got a couple folks on the other side of the room, then I'll make it back over here.
Hi, my question was, as for applying for the licensing, is there going to be a preference that people that are already own businesses, or from people that are going to be freshly applying into this?
I think from the AGLC perspective, no, there's no preference. There are, as I said, quite rigorous due diligence requirements that include criminal background checks, criminal association checks, financial background checks. So all of those, if you have gone through a similar process in another line of business that you're in, might help you in terms of your familiarity with what's involved, but it's not going to give you a leg up through the process. Everybody starts the AGLC process at square one, and everybody, as soon as their application is complete, we'll proceed through the process as quickly as the AGLC can move you through the process. So if it helps you in order to know what's in the process, fair enough, but otherwise there's no leg up from having an existing business. And I will emphasize, one of the regulatory requirements around cannabis retail business is that they be a separate business from any other business of the applicant. So they will need to have a separate corporate identity, separate financial records. Your employees will need to be separate from a payroll taxation perspective. And part of that is to allow the AGLC the right transparency to know for a cannabis retail location what individual's responsible, where's the money coming in from, where's the money going out to. So they will have to be a separate business.
Just to add on from a municipal point of view, we don't anticipate that business licensing from a city standpoint is going to take into account existing businesses either. Really, because the AGLC is being so comprehensive in what they're looking at, I wouldn't anticipate that there's going to be much more regulations from the city added to whatever the AGLC's put out there already.
Okay, I believe you had a question, Deepak. I'm going to come back to you a little bit later. So we had a question there. Howard, if we had a question from someone in the back, we'll do after this one here.
So in terms of the retail storefronts, education-wise, I know there's going to be a course through, say, the same people that do the ProServe. Is there going to be anything else, like a recognized education or a course that we can take to help us amp up our application, I guess?
Short answer is no. I mean, I think from an individual business point of view, part of your competitive advantage might be having yourselves and your employees appropriately educated in terms of the product and in terms of the offerings you want to have to consumers. From a regulatory perspective, all employees will have to go through, as you mentioned, what we're calling the Sell Safe program through the AGLC. It's a mandatory online training program similar to the ProServe program for liquor serving, for those of you who are familiar with that. The main purpose of that, though, is there is some basic product knowledge components, but it's mainly about how to check for ID and in what circumstances, and what to do with intoxicated consumers, and how to refuse service if you need to refuse service. So that's a mandatory requirement for the employees. In terms of your actual application as a retailer, there's nothing you can really supplement that with to help you. It's not a process where the AGLC looks at it qualitatively and says, yeah, we like that applicant as an overall package. It's either you go through the due diligence requirements. Either you meet the requirements or you don't, so it's not, there's nothing you can do to give yourself a leg up to kind of put a little extra in the package to get you stronger consideration. You either clear the bar or you don't.
Hi there, Lindsay Burns, your hemptress, and I am wondering if there will be sniff jars so that people can experience the product before they buy it. And federally, how long until you expect topicals? I've got lots of old ladies who just want a cream. Why can't we give the older women a cream? So please, yes.
So quickly on the sniff jars, yes, they will be allowed in Alberta. It will actually be the only circumstance in the retail store in which any of the product can be removed from the sealed and stamped packaging that comes from a federally licensed processor. So everything that you sell will have to be sealed and prepackaged. We will allow the sniff testers, and the AGLC is putting together some requirements around which ones and what they'll have to look like, but those will be allowed.
Hi there. To your other question. So there are licensed producers today that will sell you an oil that you can combine with a cream that comes with the cannabis oil. So that's one option for you in the short term. I'll say, though, that we're looking at a second phase of regulations where we'll be considering a broader range of product categories. The one that we get asked about most frequently, of course, is cannabis products that can be eaten. And certainly in the case of edibles and concentrates, We had a lot of conversations with U.S. states that have already legalized those products. What they've told us is that, of course, this goes a bit beyond your specific question, but what they've told us is that those products represent a number of really unique health risks, right? They can be mistaken for products that don't contain cannabis. They can be accidentally consumed. They can be accidentally overconsumed. So what we heard from colleagues in the States is really take your time studying those products so that you understand the unique health risks that they represent. So with that in mind, if you look at the legislation, and I know you do, if you look at the legislation, there's now a clause right in the legislation that commits us to bringing edibles and a broader range of products online within a year of the Cannabis Act coming into effect. And we certainly recognize that if we want to displace the illicit market in Canada, we're going to need to do that.
Are there any questions over on your side, Howard? He's got that woman back here, and then you, and then you if we have enough time. We've got 5, 6 minutes left, but I think everyone is going to be available afterwards to speak in the back corner as well. Okay.
Hi. At what point in the application process would a person have to secure a lease? Would it be before the application process or sometime during?
So in order to get a license from the AGLC, you will eventually have to have a signed and executed lease. In order to submit the initial application, all the AGLC is requiring is an offer to lease. And that's an exception to the way they would normally do things based on the fact that we don't have total certainty around the dates. So an offer to lease is acceptable to start the process. In order to get the license, you need a signed lease.
Hi there. As far as the creams go, I still had another question. I know there are some places in the city that you can go to, stores, and purchase, for example, CBD oil or CBD topical creams, and I was curious about the legality of these stores that are already in existence.
Hi. So the only way that you can legally purchase cannabis products in Canada today is through the access, basically the program that regulates medical access. And you would have to buy it directly from one of the federally licensed producers. So any storefront facility where you can buy cannabis-based products is not legal. And the products that you're buying are not federally regulated. So they may not be pure, they may contain pesticides. So you definitely want to be cautious about that.
Sorry, just as a follow-up. So I know some of these places are licensed by the City of Calgary to be in operation. For example, hemp shops that sell CBD only. That's more my specific question. Topical creams that have no THC whatsoever that are being sold in storefronts that are licensed by the City of Calgary. I'm curious about the legality of those shops.
So from the city's perspective, if there's shops that have city business licenses for retail, it would be like a Max convenience store or something like that. The city business license does not authorize anybody to sell cannabis-related products. They still remain federally illegal. If somebody has a business license, that doesn't have any bearing on the fact that they're also selling an illegal product. So we're not at the city giving anybody authorization to sell cannabis products at this point, and they would be doing so breaking federal law.
Hi there. My question is probably more to the federal government. It's my understanding that the black market is fully prepared to lower their price to $5 or less. That's going to make this retail market uncompetitive, and it can quite easily go down to less than $100 an ounce. I mean, $1,600 for a pound is, quite conceivable for even a small basement grower to still, make his profits and be quite content with that. So let's say he was to bring it down to $1,200 a pound, that's $75 an ounce. You could be able to buy grams, 7 grams at a time for literally $5 a gram or less. So how are we going to deal with that as retailers and as an industry when the black market continues to lower its price, despite our efforts?
Yeah, So, I mean, definitely this is going to, the issue is very price sensitive, right? The decision, I think, for a consumer to move from the unregulated to the regulated industry will be based on a lot of things. It'll be based on, you know, potentially wanting to access a product that is regulated and, you know, quote unquote safe for consumption. It'll be based on accessibility, right? Can I walk up the street and go to a retail outlet and purchase that product? And price is, of course, a third factor that will be weighed in when people are making that determination. So, you know, obviously at the federal level, we're monitoring illicit market prices very closely. Any of the conversations that are being had between finance ministers around the application of excise tax is informed by an analysis of what we feel the legitimate market will be able to bear. And there may just need to be some adjustments over time if the situation that you're playing out materializes going forward. Well, I can't speak to lowering excise taxes specifically, but well, I mean, they're going to be market driven, of course.
Hi, regarding the CBD products that we were talking about earlier, I've actually visited one of these clinics and their rationale behind their legality was that they're hemp-based CBD products, not cannabis-based. Is there any truth behind that?
So, I mean, it's very difficult to say without actually seeing the product that you're talking about and the information that's on the product. I mean, certainly I've seen like hemp-based hand creams at a Winners. I mean, that's probably not problematic. But any product that contains CBD, to my knowledge, you know, certainly. Yeah, any product that contains CBD that I can think of would qualify as a medical product. And in Canada today, under the current regulatory framework, there are only 3 ways that you could gain access to cannabis for medical purposes. As I mentioned before, you can buy it from a licensed producer, or you can apply to Health Canada to grow it, or designate someone to grow it on your behalf. And in any of those cases, you would require a medical document from a physician.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so we have time for 2 quick questions left, and then that's going to be it. I'm sorry you couldn't get to everyone else, but like I say, all of our speakers will be available to speak in the back of the room for at least a little bit afterwards as well.
My question is to AGLC. How is AGLC going to handle their agreements with the producers as far as getting product? And how are they going to handle distribution? And are those agreements going to be made public?
Thank you for the question. And just to clarify, I'm not actually with the AGLC. I'm with the provincial government, but speaking on their behalf here today. What I can tell you is that they have just concluded a public expression of interest process whereby they received submissions from more than 30 licensed producers across Canada, and they're very pleased with the results of that process and the amount of supply and the general pricing that has been indicated will be available to Alberta and for Alberta. So over the coming weeks, you can stay tuned for the details of those agreements as they are concluded. But right now, essentially, the submissions are in, they're reviewing those, and from that, agreements will emerge.
I hope that they are going to buy from Alberta producers.
That is certainly a very important consideration, and we have a number of licensed producers that are in various stages of the approval process in Alberta. Quite frankly, on day one, we're not going to be able to meet all of Alberta's needs from cannabis produced in Alberta. We are going to have to look outside just because of how much volume we need.
Could I just ask each of you to comment on who's going to monitor the regulations in each of your jurisdictions? Are these new officers? Are they existing officers? How will you monitor and enforce the regulations?
Yep, so I can speak to that from a federal perspective. The federal government will be regulating cannabis production as it does today under the Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes regulations. In order to do that, we have inspectors situated across the country, but I can tell you that the number of inspectors is already beginning to increase and will continue to increase quite dramatically leading up to legalization. Just to give you kind of a a scale estimate, we had, I want to say, in May of last year, we had in the neighborhood of 38 licensed producers across the country. Today, there are 90 licensed producers, and there are a very large number of applicants that are making their way through the application queue. So yes, really, expanding quite dramatically our inspection capacity on the ground. And I'll mention that we have one of the most robust, I would say, inspection processes of any federally regulated industry. Some of our licensed producers can be inspected, 6, 7, 8 times over the course of a single year. This will be particularly true when they're newly licensed and don't have a compliance record yet. So that's the answer for the federal side.
I would say there's 3 elements at least to enforcement, one of which is drug-impaired driving, which we haven't actually talked about a lot today, but and it's obviously not a new concern or a new problem, but there are some new criminal code provisions that are going to need to be enforced, and so we're working with our federal partners in terms of providing the training resources and the oral fluid screening devices that officers can use at roadside. So there's that component to supporting enforcement efforts. On the regulatory side, the main push in Alberta will be through the AGLC, and they are currently in the process of hiring significant additional staff to take on those responsibilities. And that's one of the reasons people kind of look at us askance and say, how can you say, in the initial couple of years, this is going to cost the government more money than it takes in? Well, there are actually a significant number of additional AGLC inspectors and others that are going to have to be hired to make sure that particularly in the initial years, we have good security on that supply chain to make sure that the product that's on the shelves in retailers has come through the AGLC from a federally licensed producer, and that nothing else is coming in or going out the back door of retailers. So there's that AGLC component, and then the third component is a municipal bylaw enforcement piece.
So, and short answer is we are anticipating there's obviously going to be impacts as far as additional resources being required. What that turns out to be is really going to be a result of what the federal and provincial regulations turn out to be at the end of the day. So we did get more clarity from the AGLC on what they're planning on tackling. We had anticipated perhaps taking on more as far as municipality goes in that regard. So we're continuing to adjust what we're going to need, but we do expect there's going to be impacts to the Calgary Police Services, to municipal bylaw enforcement, to business license inspectors, to development inspections, and all the rest. So there's going to be, we are undertaking a comprehensive review, and once we have more clarity as to exactly what's going to be required, we'll have a better idea of what the numbers will be.
Okay, that is all the time we have. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but we've already gone over time. Let's have a round of applause for all of our panelists today. And as I mentioned, they